Hi there, and welcome back to another video in the Engaging with Art series. On this third part of our discussion on color, I'm discussing agency. And there are two types of agency I want to discuss, that being intrinsic and extrinsic. Both videos that came prior to this one about color fit into one of those categories more or less. So when it comes to color's utilization, what do I mean by agency and this extrinsic-intrinsic dichotomy I mentioned? Well, I think it's important to remember that color is active on its own, and then it's also being employed by the artist in another sense of activity. And so this is where we have these two different sort of ideas. Returning back to our previous video on symbolism, I think that's a really good example of extrinsic agency because typically symbolism is something that the artist is promulgating or that society is building upon or creating those associations. So it's not something that's happening on part of the color itself. Emotion, on the other hand, I think is a little bit more of a gray area. I do believe that the artist has the capability to employ color emotionally and to establish that as a principle in artwork. At the same time, however, I think it's an intrinsic quality of color because as we described in one of the previous videos, there's sort of a natural potency that color emotes in different capacities or for different people, that sort of thing. So that's one example, and I just kind of want to start there to give a broad overview of like what I mean by agency and how this is functioning. Now let's look more specifically at both of these types, beginning with intrinsic agency. These are the perceptible attributes inherent to the qualities of color and the relationships between them. And so essentially what I mean is that the way we see color and the way color is depicted upon our eyes is naturally going to have a certain effect, and color doesn't need any other outside force to exude that. The first example of that is temperature. When you're looking at colors, warmer colors will proceed into the foreground while cooler colors will recede into the background. And I think this is something that's pretty easy to recognize right on the surface value, but sometimes I think we miss it if we're not paying attention. When you have two different colors juxtaposed to one another, I think you'll see this most handedly, and then this kind of moves into another quality of color intrinsically regarding agency, and that's complementarity. This returns back to our discussion on Joseph Albers, who was studying color relationships. And you can sort of think about the color wheel relationships in this sense too. If you're unfamiliar with the color wheel, I would say Google it and you'll quickly find it. It's a very good study tool to look at the different relationships between colors and how they interact. Here again, we have a natural tendency of color as how we perceive it with our vision. So Joseph Albers, for example, was not establishing these relationships, but rather when you consider his work, he was really identifying them for the public, for all of us, for artists, things that we already knew that already existed, but just sort of putting a name to them and sort of categorizing them more specifically. That is another reason why complementarity is something that I would describe as an intrinsic agency of color itself. One final example to consider with intrinsic agency is contrast. Contrast is that ability for color to form actual shape through juxtaposition. So in one sense, you can think of how black lines on a white canvas will work to create shapes when closed or what have you. That might sound kind of weird or vague, but I again think contrast is a natural intrinsic agency of color because the different colors themselves can form shapes when they're next to each other and forms without necessarily having the artist to force that. Obviously, the artist has to form the color on the canvas, but color, because of the relationships it shares with one another and how we perceive different colors next to each other, it naturally sort of creates that sense of contrast as well. Something that's a bit more vague, however, and that I described in the previous two videos, is this idea of the associative power of color. Is this intrinsic? Is this extrinsic? And as I was mentioning earlier, I think it's a little bit of both. There is something to it when it comes to the emotional power of color that I think comes naturally from it, that it might be an intrinsic agency within the color, where you have these associations that seem so deeply rooted in us that they're inescapable. That red is associated with heat and warmth, and so it can evoke emotions within us that are more vibrant, that are lively, that are more hyper energized. Whereas blue is associated with water and peace and serenity, and so it can have naturally sort of this calming effect. The gray area here, however, is when an artist is able to also utilize this and will utilize this deliberately. And so I think, again, there's both going on. It's not to say that it's not intrinsic nor extrinsic, but rather I think it's both at the same time and in different capacities. Moving away from that, however, I want to consider now extrinsic agency, or you might also even think of this as conceptual agency. And that is when an outside agent is utilizing color with an intent behind it, and that's where that agency comes from. One very major example, and what I described in the previous video, was symbolism, is that artists will utilize color to create symbols or to play on pre-existing symbols within society, and that's something that the color isn't doing on its own. That's something that has been placed upon the color through the work of the artist or the culture, or however you want to consider it. There's an outside agency, there's an outside identity or entity, really, that is giving that sense of association that the artist is then just utilizing or employing. One example I wrote down is red used like blood. It has a very symbolic power, obviously, because we look at human blood as being red when it's spilled. And at the same time, there's a lot of emotion behind that too. So it's a bit of a twofold, multiple associative relationship going on there. But that's something, again, that's not necessarily intrinsic to color, but is sort of placed upon us naturally as a symbolic power. Another extrinsic sort of agency I want to describe, and as I was mentioning earlier, is this emotional potential that artists will utilize with color. And again, I think this is something that artists can very much do deliberately and can choose to do in their work. One example especially is the Expressionism movement, which most people will associate with artists like Jackson Pollock. These types of artists are employing the colors that they are feeling are evoking something particular. So that's why I describe it as an extrinsic agency in this case, because the artist is very much seeking internally, what are these colors doing within me, and expressing that on the canvas in hopes that the viewer is going to have a similar experience, or have an experience, rather, that is put upon by the artist through this motion of painting, through this motion of art production. This is something that's very niche, and it should be considered on a case-by-case basis. You should really want to look and see, is this a type of artist that is more towards expressionism, or just simply is active in employing color emotionally, or has that as part of their practice? Because this is something that, again, skirts the line where maybe it's something that is slightly intrinsic to color, but when the artist is really grabbing hold of this and identifying it as a tool of their practice, then I think it's more of an extrinsic agency. To use some of my own work for an example, I do believe that color is something that I use as an agency. I think very much extrinsically. I think I very much do it deliberately, trying to also recognize the power the color has on its own. But my work, because I describe it as neo-expressionism to a degree, I think there is a great deal of it that is an extrinsic agency on my part. One example is the Windows series that I want to describe. There are 6 colors in this palette. I use these colors very specifically, and the colors shift agency from piece to piece, interestingly. I think this is what really inspired me to discuss the idea of agency too with regards to color. Now, when I say they shift agency, I mean in some pieces, they're more active than others. Some pieces in the series use all 6 colors, but most do not. And that's very intentional and very specific. Every piece that comes out of the series, actually, I always identify as having one color that was sort of the primary or the star player of that piece with regards to how it was motivating the actions behind the work. This whole idea of agency speaks to the twofold nature of the Windows series as well, because on one hand, it's considering how the human person is translated, diluted, misunderstood, and warped through the online interfaces and world, while on the other hand, it's my internal mouthpiece and working through my emotions, my challenges in relation to the online world, and just at the present time of the production of these pieces. So this twofold nature of the series is very much promulgated by these 6 colors and how I utilize them iteration to iteration. In some cases, I'm using these colors to create imagery, to create associations that might evoke interfaces or evoke actual text or words, and I will do that very deliberately. In other cases, I'm using these as much more of an emotional capacity, or trying to form associations that will lead people to an emotional tendency or an emotional attachment that I'm sort of feeling and trying to express through the work. One of the pieces very specifically that comes to mind is Windows 006, The Rain, which the palette in that is very specific because, as the title suggests, I very specifically wanted to evoke a sense of dripping, wet rain in this piece. And so, as you can imagine, the cerulean blue and the light cerulean blue utilized in this piece are done in a manner that's meant to evoke that wetness and evoke that sense of rain. I'll leave a link in the description of this video to that piece if you want to look at it for yourself. To wrap things up, I want to discuss, as I usually do, what this means for us as the viewers. How can we be informed by this idea of color having agency in a way that will then help us to more deeply connect with art? Again, I think the most important thing is just to acknowledge that color does have agency. And then to next go deeper, and the next step there would become, okay, is what I'm viewing intrinsic or extrinsic in this case, or more likely, what is the combination of both at play? For us as viewers, a big piece of advice I have is just doing some light research or study into color. Like I said, pull up the color wheel for yourself, to explore some of these relationships, try to memorize what the complementary color relationships are and that sort of thing. The more you do that, the more you actively engage with color, the more you'll train your eye to be ready to just perceive those intrinsic qualities, those qualities that are evergreen with color, that never change, that, like I said, temperature, contrast, complementarity, those relationships. If we train ourselves to recognize those, then you're taking a lot of the steps out for yourself whenever you're sitting down to view work that has a lot of color involved. And also as viewers, as we start to take note of the nuance and the utilization of color within an artist's work and the agency behind that on the part of the artist, it really can offer a doorway for us into the work more deeply. In order to help train yourself in that regard, I would say start by looking at artists that really do use color with a lot of agency, like the Expressionists, like Jackson Pollock, for example. Take a look at the work as it progresses, take a look at the work and different examples from that same artist, and just try to inventory for yourself. What is the artist trying to say? What is the artist trying to emote through this? And once you start to pick up on this, again, I think you'll be more primed to understand in the future when you view other artwork, how artists are engaging with color in an agency capacity of their own accord and what that looks like and how that's done. I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and I hope it's been very much worthwhile. Please share with anybody else who might benefit from this, and until the next one, take care.